On these Friday nights when we have a few teachings, I'll probably come down early. So if you've got a testimony or gifts or something, then that's I'll do quickly, because I may come down before you have time then. But that way, these will be hour-long teachings each, and we will only be here till 9:30. Tonight we're going to be looking the second time at Christian ethics. So you can be preparing for that in between whenever I run back upstairs for a few moments after intertestamental period. And so next week it probably won't be Christian ethics. It'll probably be either intertestamental period or biblical lit. And I don't know that I'll always know until, that day or a few days before. Last time we looked at the numerical extent of the diaspora. About 10% of the Roman population in general, remember, was made up of Jewish people. To give you those figures again, there were 3 million Jews in Palestine, or 5 to 6 million Jews in the Roman Empire. There's 1 to 2 million Jews in the Eastern world, which was east of the boundaries of the Roman Empire. So we're talking about 9, 10, 11 million Jews. The Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world. Now it's time for us to look at the various locales of the diaspora in a 1 or 2 or 3 part study. Tonight will be part 1 of the lands of the diaspora. To see where the people were, where did they end up in these dispersions, and what was going on with them there. Chiefly where they were, though, and a little bit politically and socially of what they were doing in these lands. Now we're going to divide this part of our study up into 2 parts. Roman numeral 1 will be the East, which is what we'll look at tonight, and Roman numeral 2 will be the West. The West will include the whole Roman Empire. The East will include that territory east of the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And we'll either do in 1 or 2 messages the second Roman numeral that I just gave you, the West or the Roman Empire. So tonight we'll look at the East. By this that I mean areas that are not part of the Roman Empire, specifically Mesopotamia. It's a big word, but you've got it in the back of your Bible on some map if you don't know how to spell it. Mesopotamia, or you can put the Fertile Crescent. This would include countries such as Babylonia. We often refer to the whole country by the name of the city Babylon. We talk about Babylon, but we're speaking by synecdoche, by extension there, where we're talking about a part of the country, namely its capital, Babylon, and by synecdoche or metonymy, we're moving it to refer to the whole country. But officially, the country would be referred to as Babylonia. Elam, E-L-A-M, Parthia, Media, and Armenia. Babylonia, Elam, Parthia, Media, and Armenia. The Eastern world, outside of the Roman Empire. The Jews are here due to the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities primarily. Although in later times some no doubt travel there voluntarily, perhaps for other purposes. So here we have the oldest of the great diaspora communities. Now Jews may well have been outside of the confines of Palestine years, maybe a few centuries prior to this, and we'll discuss that whenever we look at parts 2 and perhaps parts 3 of this study, Lands of the Diaspora. But that is not so much diaspora as officially as this is, because it certainly has to do with the deportations of the people under the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So let's divide this up into 2 sections then. We're going to look at the Assyrian captivity and what happened with the people there, and then the Babylonian captivity and what happened to the people there. So I hope you're able to stay up with my breakdown and my outline of this. Looking at the East, there were 2 important, significant captivities through which the people went, the Assyrian, the Babylonian. The Assyrian in 722 B.C. is recorded for us in 2 Kings 17. And I want to take a little time to read a rather long passage there from the NIV, because we mentioned this passage a few weeks ago. This is our 5th or 6th message now on the diaspora. And I said then that we just didn't have time in that teaching to read it, but I just mentioned it and we might have flipped over there. I don't even think that we did that. But 2 Kings chapter 17, it's a rather long chapter. We're not going to read all 40 or so verses here, but 41 verses. But we'll look at a few of those, starting with verse 7, that detail in a rather monotonous tone, I might add, the captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 to 721 BC. And the historian of 2 Kings is giving us the reason why. And he said that the reason why is because they have forsaken the covenant that God has made with them. And so God is not forsaking them eternally and, unconditionally, but it's a temporary, although rather extreme form of discipline or chastisement. All this took place, the coming in of Shalmaneser and Sargon and the other kings of Assyria that played a role. Shalmaneser first, and then Sargon evidently was the king who actually took the city of Samaria. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them. You see, you can get all of the Christians' spiritual lessons and spiritual teachings from the history of the nation of Israel, as Paul says on at least 2 occasions in some of his epistles in the New Testament. But the command for Israel was to go into Palestine and rid Palestine of the evil influence, exterminate these 7 or more pagan nations that are found there. And whenever she doesn't, she begins to mingle with them in their worldview, their philosophy, their theology, their practice of life, their ethic, then is adopted by the nation of Israel. And Israel falls deeper and deeper and deeper into the participation of the pagan customs of those nations, concerning whom the Lord said, drive out to begin with and exterminate them from the oldest man to the youngest child, exterminate them, or they're going to have a very evil and very profound influence upon you. And you see, the exact same thing is true in the Christian's life and in the church today. The more the church in our world identifies with the world, the more pagan she becomes, because she becomes like those pagan nations. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns, and they set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. It's always back to a reference to that. They had broken their part of the covenant. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, you shall not do this. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey, that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets. But they would not listen. They were as stiff-necked as their fathers, who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their fathers, the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols, and they became worthless. They imitated the nations, and we're back to that again. Around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do. And they did the things the Lord had forbidden them to do. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God, and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves, one at Dan and one at Samaria. An Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts, so astrology and worship of the heavenly bodies, and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire, so the worship of Moloch. They practiced divination and sorcery, and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. In verse 21, when he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam son of Nebat their king. And Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit great sin. So many times after this, you had such and such sin to sin after the sins of Jeroboam, after the sins of Jeroboam, after the sins of Jeroboam. because he's the one who began it all in some official capacity anyway in the northern kingdom whenever it was divided after the death of Solomon. Now, we need to cover something. There are other places to cover this question, this theory, such as whenever we discuss some of the false cults, but I think now is also an appropriate place just to throw in a few moments worth of discussion in this area. The lack of a detailed, specific account of their return, like we have for the southern kingdom, with Zerubbabel, with Ezra, and Nehemiah, and with Zechariah and Haggai. The lack of any detailed, specific account of their return has led to the formation of various fantastic theories about the northern tribes and the northern nation of Israel. And perhaps the best known of these and the most widespread is the so-called Anglo or British Israelism view, also known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel theory. Now, have you ever heard of this before? Are you familiar with that phrase? Well, good. Good, yes, Herbert W. Armstrong, that's one of the cornerstones of the Worldwide Church of God in Pasadena, California. But it officially is known as Anglo or British Israelism. Just Israel, I-S-M. Anglo-Israelism. Well, that's good if you already know something. You see, that helps. You know, you appreciate and can comprehend and follow the teachings better whenever you already know something about these matters. So wherever you've heard something about it, it's a popular view. It's a very popular view. So I doubt that you owe a debt to this church for having heard of that. You probably heard of that before you ever hear. Well, it's an interesting theory. The 10 lost tribes of Israel. I mean, have you ever wondered, why don't we have a book on their return? We got several books, Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah, dealing with the return of the southern kingdom, Judah. See, the lack of a specific, detailed account has led to this theory. We know what happened to Judah. She went into Babylon, and she was restored. So says Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and we can even find it in Chronicles and some other places. What happened to the northern kingdom of Israel? What about those tribes there? Perhaps they didn't return. Perhaps the northern kingdom was just so wicked that God wiped his hands clean of them, cast them off forever, eternally. And assuming that would be true, that God did cast them off and there is no restoration of the northern kingdom, we don't have any books dealing with that like we do with the southern kingdom, then assuming that's true, then perhaps this whole theory is right, that those people, the 10 tribes of Israel that went into Assyrian captivity, they made up the stock, the flesh, the blood, the bone of the nation of England, and by migration, the nation of the United States of America as well. At least portions of the English people, whether in the old world or over here in the new world. And so that, in essence, is what the 10 lost tribes of Israel theory is all about. That the tribes were lost in captivity, the 10 northern tribes, not Judah and Benjamin, the 2 southern, that stayed faithful to God around the temple liturgy and the cultic sacrificial service there at Jerusalem, but the 10 northern tribes. No detailed account of their return. Perhaps they go into Assyrian captivity and they're never heard of again. And so secretly, perhaps known to God but not known to any man, secretly they are the ones who, through migration, end up in Europe and end up in England, and they are the stock from which the English people come. And Herbert W. Armstrong has fantastic theories about this, such as the name of Abraham's son, Isaac. And if you kind of rearrange the letters a little bit, you can almost see, Saxon out of that. So you get the Anglo-Saxon people from Isaac. And we know the Anglo-Saxon people are the English people. And a lot of people anyway, in the United States have come from an English stock, from a British stock. And so then people like Herbert W. Armstrong and Ted Garner and all the other devotees of his worldwide Church of God, as well as some people who perhaps do not devote themselves to Armstrong's form of religion, would still constitute the long lost descendants of these original 10 tribes that went into Assyrian captivity. So you see another place where this could be discussed whenever we discuss false cults. such as Armstrongism in Pasadena, California. But it fits here as well because we're talking about the diaspora. The Jews are scattered through these dispersions. They're scattered through these captivities. And so the thinking student and reader of the Old Testament would ask himself, well, what happened to those nations then? We're very familiar with the return of the southern kingdom. We have detailed, specific, almost to the point of being boring, accounts of how many people came from this family and this father and that tribe. If you look in the first few chapters of both Nehemiah and Ezra, but particularly the book of Ezra. Now once you get to chapter 6 through 10, well, it's easy to read. But 1 to 5, 1's a short chapter. 2 through 5 of Ezra, difficult to read because it's enumeration after enumeration after enumeration. Schofield and his the new Schofield, the 1967, not the turn of the century one, but the 1967 edition of Schofield's Bible, which did quite a bit of revising work of the earlier one, on page 446 has a rather extensive footnote dealing in 5 points with a proof that these 10 lost tribes were really not lost. Now it's rather long. It's the whole bottom of this page from this line that I'm showing you all the way down here, 5 elaborate points. So I'll refer you to that if you want to see this. I don't think I want to take the time. He's certainly right and very good in what he has to say here. There are not, as some assert, 10 lost tribes, known only to God and later to be found by him, variously conjectured to be the Anglo-Saxon people, the Gypsies. That's another theory of some people that they made up the Gypsies. And the Gypsies have been famous people in European history and then again by transference, American history as well. And what's the origin of Gypsies? Who are the Gypsies? I mean, what's their bloodline? I mean, they are a strange group of people. That's an interesting study in itself. They have been proverbially lambasted in caricatures, I think, but they are a very interesting, distinct group of people, the Gypsies. So from whom do they come? Or certain peoples of Central Asia or Africa. These misconceptions arise from a misreading of passages such as 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 23, just what we've been reading here. And especially verse 18. What does 18 say? So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left. Then he goes on. That's his introduction through 5 different points. They just look too long to try to discuss them in any detail, although I'm sure it would be profitable. So I'll stay with my own, what I have down here to share with you tonight, which is rather brief, maybe not as thorough as Schofield, but all you need is 1 or 2 verses that conclusively prove it, and the case is nailed shut then. So here would be my answer to this whole theory. I'm sure Armstrong would turn over in his grave, he's dead now, I believe, if he heard me deal with his whole doctrine in a couple of moments, but I'm not too concerned because I think he's lower than the grave anyway. Evidently, God desired that the entire nation go into captivity before he gave a record of the entire nation being restored. In one sentence, that's how I would explain it. That's what I see from a study of the Old Testament. Evidently, he desired that the entire nation go into captivity before giving us a record of the entire nation being restored. Well, doesn't that make sense? I mean, he could say, well, I'm going to give you 4 books on the restoration of the first captivity and then 4 more books on the restoration of the second captivity, but we only have so much space in our Old Testament for these things to be included. Of course, he could have enlarged the Old Testament. I don't mean that. But it makes sense to me. Let's just wait until the whole business of sin and chastisement is over with, and then we'll give a history of the restoration of all the people. Well, the lay student of the Scriptures might think, well, in reading those books like Ezra and Nehemiah, I didn't realize that was a restoration of the northern kingdom. I thought that was a restoration of the southern kingdom. Well, Babylon, what happened to Assyria after Assyria took the northern kingdom captive a while after that? What happened to Assyria? Babylon overran Assyria. And then what does Babylon do as far as Judah is concerned? Babylon overruns Judah. That means Judah ends up over in Assyria, in Babylon. That means Assyria and her land and her peoples and her subjects now become the subjects of Babylon. Therefore, if we're going to talk about a Babylonian restoration, that is, a restoration of Jews from Babylonia, then we're talking about Babylonia as the conqueror of Assyria. So we can't divide those nations up afterwards. Afterwards, we don't have two nations, Assyria and Babylonia. We have the remnants of Assyria making up the fibers and the blood vessels of the kingdom of Babylon or Babylonia. So when Babylon comes in and conquers Assyria, then Babylon becomes the successor to Assyria and her control of the diaspora Jews that are there. Therefore, whenever the exiles return from Babylon, they're returning from Babylonian-Assyrian captivity. It's just that since the Babylonian captivity is the most recent one, then there's no sense in hyphenating the name and giving us Assyrian-Babylonian captivity. We just call it Babylonian. And since we know that Babylonia overtook Assyria, we're talking about two different peoples, two different dispersions. We're talking about two different groups of Jews then who will be found in the return. Now, it might be argued, and it may correctly be argued, that the preponderance of the returning Jews were, in fact, from the 586 captivity. That probably is true. I don't know that we have a whole lot of proof for that, but then again, the amount of information given in the post-exilic writing seems to lean very decidedly and very heavily in favor of the southern kingdom. So perhaps because the northern kingdom went over several centuries earlier, that those people were more incorporated into their land and into their masters, the master race there, and they decided therefore not to return home. But let's look at some scriptures that will, I don't think, it's just very obvious to anyone who accepts the infallibility and inspiration of Scripture that there's no such thing as the 10 lost tribes of Israel theory. That the post-exilic books that most people feel deal only with the returning exiles of the southern kingdom of Judah, in fact, give numerous references that those returning exiles came from all 12 tribes. Now, 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 3. Though the preponderance is probably from the Babylonian, the southern, the more recent, the 586 captivity. Now, these are verses that it will be good to know something about. Just the argument that I've given you without any scriptures is enough to prove the case. Since Babylon overtakes Assyria, then Babylon succeeds Assyria as being the masters of the diaspora Jews that were settled there. But it's very good to know these things. That's why we study these things systematically. I'm listening to some tapes right now, just off and on whenever I've got the extra time, of a former friend of ours, a minister that we knew, and only a pastor can really identify with what another pastor is thinking and going through. And I can identify with him so well. The struggle in his church, the lack of response of his people. I mean, we've been blessed with the manifold hundreds times what they ever had as far as response of people is concerned there, as far as any vitality in the church is concerned. And so you just kind of read the newspaper and pray that week and try to get a message that you hope will meet everyone's needs that week and somehow turn the church around, get everyone on fire for God, and you can go on happily ever after that. And my heart I feel so sorry for people like that. I was telling my wife on the way here tonight, I said, you look back after several years and you haven't done anything. The church doesn't have any direction. You haven't built. There's no development. The teaching is not developed. You've had potpourri messages here and there about everything, hitting and missing on this topic and that topic. You're not building anywhere. Amen. Wouldn't that be miserable, wretched to look back on that and think we're not going anywhere? We don't have any purpose. We don't have any goal or any drive. Believe it or not, that's what we're doing here. We have a goal and a drive through all these teachings. And like I was telling a sister the other day, I said, well, you couldn't possibly remember a tenth, 100th of the tens of thousands. Think if we added all of the tapes together. The tens of thousands of dates and references and scriptures and doctrines and names and places and proofs for things. It'd be impossible to remember all of that. what I said. Anyone who knows anything about, well, just the power of words and public speaking and public persuasion, know that whenever you sit under something, they can be talking about anything from electronics to morals and philosophy. They're building your worldview. Whether you know it or not, that's what they're doing to you. To whom you yield yourself slaves to listen to, their slaves you are. They're building your worldview. They build your outlook on things, and they shape your whole personality and the way you think about things, even though you could never in 1,000 years sit down and repeat everything that's been said. That's one of the arguments against studying anything. Well, we don't remember any of it. People remember more of it in the change of their character than they realize. Not the repetition of the dates and names, but you remember more than you know. It's just you don't know that you're changing so much. You're changing as you're here and listening.
Praise God. Amen.
Verse 3 of 1 Chronicles 9. Now, 1 Chronicles 9, remember Chronicles, these are post-exilic books here. The other books probably are before the exile. At least Samuel, Kings maybe before, maybe part of that after. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles are certainly post-exilic. And what 1 Chronicles 9 is giving us here is a list of some of the returning exiles. So you have to know that before this will make any sense to you at all. This is after the Babylonian captivity. This is after the return of the people under Zerubbabel and so forth. All Israel is listed in genealogies recorded in the book of the kings of Israel. Remember, when they came back, their genealogies, which had been somewhat disrupted, were very important to establish, who was of Levitical descent, who was of the descent of Judah, who should live where, and so forth. The people of Judah were taken captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now, the first to resettle, all right, we're talking about the returning exiles. On their own property, in their own towns, were some Israelites. He gives 4 divisions here: Israelites, priests, Levites, the temple servants. Verse 3, though, is the verse that you need to remember. Those from Judah, from Benjamin, from Ephraim, from Manasseh, who lived in Jerusalem, were. Well, there's a proof that just destroys the whole foundation and cornerstone to Herbert W. Armstrong's Anglo-Israelism. One verse here, returning exiles. They came from Judah and Benjamin. We'd expect those 2 tribes. That's the southern nation there. Ephraim and Manasseh, those are 2 of the 10 so-called lost tribes. Now, if they're lost, then how do we get these people back in Jerusalem? Resettling Jerusalem and taking, again, property there. One verse, and that's not all we have, but one verse is enough to destroy that. We'll turn to another post-exilic book, Ezra, chapter 6 and verse 17. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered, rebuilt temple, 100 bulls, 200 rams, because you see what they might say about that verse is, well, that's only 2 tribes, so we don't have a 10 lost tribes of Israel theory, we at least have an 8 lost tribes of Israel theory, because only Ephraim and Manasseh are mentioned. Offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male goats, and as a sin offering for all Israel, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, 1 for each of the tribes of Israel. That means that they're all represented now back in Palestine. And evidently they're all represented back in southern Palestine, because we're talking about the capital city of Judah, which of course is, or the capital area of Judah, and the city of Jerusalem, which of course is where the temple is. This is repeated over in chapter 8 and verse 35. Then the exiles who had returned from captivity. What happened to those exiles? Sacrificed burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel. But they still might say, well, that doesn't mean that 12 tribes were there represented. Only 2 were there represented, or at most we would give you 4 from 1 Chronicles 9:3. But they are kind of symbolically and in hope representing the whole nation of Israel, that perhaps God someday in the future will restore the nation. Well, of course, that never happened, so they offered it in vain if Armstrong's theory is correct, because those tribes never were restored to Palestine. But in fact, they became the root and stock of England and of the United States of America. So let's go on. We're not out of scriptures yet. Let's go on to Jeremiah, chapter 41 and verse 5. Now, Jeremiah is post-exilic writing and prophet if we're talking about the northern captivity. He's way after 722. So let's see what he has to say about these northern people. Chapter 41 and verse 5. This is even after the fall of Jerusalem, of course, but he's not post-exilic like Ezra and Nehemiah, just after the first exile of the northern kingdom into Assyria. Let's see, the day after Gedaliah's assassination, before anyone knew about it, 80 men who had shaved off their beards, torn their clothes, and cut themselves came from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria, bringing grain offerings and incense with them to the house of the Lord. Now, why they're doing this has several different explanations. Of course, the temple's been destroyed. So what are they doing bringing grain offerings to the temple that Nebuchadnezzar has just leveled to the ground? Well, one explanation is that they weren't familiar with what had happened down there, but that's unlikely. They're only living a few miles north. They know what has just happened in the southern kingdom. Probably they're not bringing it to the temple. The temple doesn't exist anymore, but they still count the site as being as holy to the Lord. And so they come and offer it at the site of the old temple, which just recently now has been leveled and razed to the ground. Well, my point in turning here is the three cities. They represent the northern kingdom. These are Jewish men who come from the northern kingdom. Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria are all northern cities, not found in the south, but all northern cities. This is after the fall of Judah and Jerusalem after 586 BC, and you still got Jews living in Israel, in northern Israel. 10 lost tribes, they got lost. Well, some of them didn't even leave Palestine.
For the continuation of this message,
Lost tribes, they got lost. Well, some of them didn't even leave Palestine. You see, you've got to remember that in any case, without even having to turn to certain verses one place or the other, the Assyrian deportation of the northern kingdom was no more absolute and total than the Babylonian deportation. What type of people did Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar take back with him? Everyone? Or the best of the people? Well, I think that the same thing would have happened for the northern kingdom then. When Sargon takes his captives from the northern kingdom to Assyria, who does he take with him? Everyone? The whole of Israel, the 10 northern tribes? Well, surely not. He takes representatives, the best of them, from the 10 northern tribes. But a large number of those 10 northern tribes stay right in Palestine, right in Samaria. So this business of the fact that, it's just a naive, lay interpretation and view to think, as Armstrong does, Assyria came over and captured. We think of capture like there were 14 people and he took all 14 of them. Capturing means you defeat the people, you overthrow the city, and you take the government leaders, the political leaders, the religious leaders, and the strongest men and the prettiest women and all of that back with you. Doesn't mean that you pick every pomegranate and load it on every mule and take everything back with you. That's the brain of a what? You want to say it? A lead pipe, a fence post, a boat anchor, take your pick, or an exhaust system on your car. People just aren't thinking at all. The 10 lost tribes, they went into Assyria and down through the Middle Ages, they got lost. They're living in Palestine the whole time. 10 lost tribes, so they went over and somehow ended up in China, and then through Antarctica they made it up to England or the United States. Well, people shouldn't spend so much time dreaming up such fantastic theories. You ought to exert the energy that it takes to dream up those fantastic theories and searching the documents of the Old and the New Testaments. So you'll have something to support your view. They certainly have nothing at all. Only the best people are going to be taken. The 10 lost tribes are not lost at all. They remain right there in northern Israel. And then maybe the passage of passages. It's Jeremiah 3. Because have you noticed that if you were of the other persuasion, you could weasel your way out of these verses. You could still say, well, I realize that there were a few men left in Shiloh, Shechem, and Samaria, but still the bulk of the 10 tribes were taken to Assyria. You haven't shown me a verse that says that's not true, and they were lost later in history and became the English people. Well, here in Jeremiah 3, verses 11 through 18, we have God's solemn promise of what he's going to do to that northern kingdom. And so if we believe the word of the Lord, we're going to believe him as to what the outcome of those people was. The Lord said to me, faithless Israel. Now Jeremiah is a southern prophet, remember. So he's now talking, the Lord through him is speaking about the northern kingdom. The Lord said to me, faithless Israel is more righteous than unfaithful Judah. Go, proclaim this message toward the north. Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer, for I am merciful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt. You have rebelled against the Lord your God. You have scattered your favors to foreign gods under every spreading tree and have not obeyed me, declares the Lord. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town and two from a clan. See, it wasn't a total restoration, just like it wasn't a total deportation. And bring you to Zion. He's prophesying to Israel now, notice. Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding. In those days, when your numbers have increased greatly in the land, declares the Lord, men will no longer say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord. Now, they never did that. They worshipped at Samaria and at Dan. They were apostate. And all nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. No longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. In those days, the house of Judah will join the house of Israel. Now, the King James, I think, somewhere along there says that the house of Judah will go with the house of Israel. I think it says with, and it should be what the marginal reading is, will go to. Don't you have a marginal reading if someone's reading that? I meant to read it. Oh, we do? I meant to read this out of the King James anyway. Let me jump over there, and you can finish it if all you have is your NIV, and I'll look at it here. Because it's, NIV is okay, but this just really points something out. Verse 18, in those days the house of Judah, now the King James says, will walk with the house of Israel. And it should read, will walk to the house of Israel. Because the picture is, you get the northern kingdom over here in Assyria, and it's not walking with. The southern kingdom is going to go to them, into captivity, in other words. This is a prophecy of captivity. It's going to go to them in captivity, and then they shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers. I mean, that's the clearest verse that I know of, Jeremiah 3:18 in all of the Bible, that refutes this 10 lost tribes theory here. The northern kingdom will go over. The southern kingdom, which is worse than the northern kingdom, worse because she had the example of her northern sister and didn't follow it, will go to her into captivity, into Babylon. Assyria, it's the same place over there on the map, Mesopotamia, Tigris, Euphrates River Valley. Will go to her, and then they will come together from the land of the north. You say, but it's due east, but there's a desert, and you never cross the desert. You always go up to Haran, as Abraham did, and you drop down from the north in a southerly direction, southwesterly direction to be more precise, down into the land of Palestine. They will come from the north country down into the land that I have given as an inheritance to your fathers. Now, if Scripture means what it says, you see this discounts this whole theory of the 10 lost tribes of Israel then. And all we have to do is have a few verses here, and I don't know that Schofield gave those. He gave those arguments and perhaps more, or perhaps others beside that, but it certainly solves it as far as I'm concerned. It seems like everyone has heard of this theory as well. How many of you have heard of that theory, the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Look at this. This is almost everyone in here. And I'm sure a lot of you heard it in places besides here. I cut an article out of I think it must have been a magazine, just a short time ago. I knew that we'd be approaching this. And it just stood out like, it stood out as red as Cardinal John O'Connor's gown here. that you would find interesting. What we have here is a picture of Cardinal John O'Connor greeting the mayor of New York City, Mayor Ed Kay. It was St. Patrick's Day in America, and the Irish dyed the river green in Chicago, so this was back on St. Patrick's Day, tinted the snow emerald in the Massachusetts mountains, and painted the center stripe down Fifth Avenue in shamrock hues, so New York's 125,000 marchers wouldn't go astray. For one day, everyone was Irish. Cardinal John O'Connor had a warm embrace for Mayor Ed of New York City, who, speaking of Mayor Ed, who explained his presence at the head of the grand parade thusly: "It's part of my roots. The 10 lost tribes of Israel, we believe, ended up in Ireland." I mean, that's just right in just a magazine, just a little statement that's made there. The 10 lost tribes of Israel ended up in Ireland. And religious people, as well as non-religious, as well as irreligious people, have heard of this 10 lost tribes of Israel theory. And it's just too bad they don't spend more time listening to the report of God's Word, which will correct misconceptions in that area. But I'm not through. Let's turn over to the New Testament. The New Testament recognizes the existence of all 12 tribes, even though, as we have seen, most of them are living outside of Palestine. We've got, 2/3 of their total population living outside of Palestine. Nevertheless, the New Testament recognizes their existence, and this is hundreds of years after the northern captivity in 722 B.C. For instance, some of these verses we've looked at not long ago. James 1:1. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. Even if it is a figurative reference to Christians, it would not have been appropriate if the 10 lost tribes are now lost in England and North America. It wouldn't be an appropriate reference then. Only if these 12 tribes, even if this is a figurative reference to Christians, only if these 12 tribes as Jews still exist would the parallel have any meaning to it at all. If you've only got 2 tribes that still exist, and when you say I'm writing to the 12 tribes, you must be talking about a remnant of Christianity then, and that would hardly make any sense. So regardless of how you interpret this, and it's a disputed verse here, whether this is a reference to Jews or to Christians or to Jewish Christians or to whatever, the New Testament still recognizes the 12th tribe existence of Israel. And then in the book of Acts, we're not going to read this passage right now. I have it saved for later, but I'll give it to you. Acts 28, verses 17 through 29. You just mark that down. We'll read it later. And then Acts 26 and verse 7. You can turn here, though. The other one will be fine, but why read it twice? It fits. I want to use it somewhere else later in this study anyway. So I get all my scriptures down that I want to use, and then when I find out where I want to use them, then I come back on these notes and pencil in or pen in, don't read this now, but read it later. And then I tell myself how much later I'm going to read it, so I know we're going to come across that again. Acts 26:7. Paul here is before Agrippa. Now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers, unto which promise our 12 tribes, instantly serving God day and night, hope to come, for which hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. Paul said that promise made to the 12 tribes through our patriarchal forefathers long ago, the 12 tribes are still standing in hope of that today. Paul knew nothing of this 10 lost tribes of Israel theory. And if anyone should have known, it would have been Paul. He was an outside of Palestine diaspora Jew. Remember, he was not born in Jerusalem. He was not born a Palestinian Jew. He was born up in Tarsus of Cilicia. So he was a diaspora Jew. He was not a Palestinian Jew. If anyone should know what's going on with all these people, the Jews outside of Palestine, it would be someone like Paul, who not only was born outside, although raised in Jerusalem, but who after his conversion spent most of his life traveling all over the Roman world outside of the boundaries of Palestine. And he comes into contact with many Jewish people, as you'll see in that later in that Acts 28 verses 17 through 29 passage. So he should know where the people are and what's going on with them. And he said there's still 12 tribes. And he went way over to Spain, and he didn't get over there and say, I found those 10 lost tribes all you boys have been looking for. They're just across the channel here, just a little bit north of us, up in England. They're all camped out in a little cave together. I found all of them up there. Well, we could probably make some mocking caricatures of Armstrong's theory. No, he said our 12 tribes are still serving God, still waiting for this hope to be fulfilled. So there's where some of the people are in the Assyrian captivity. And secondly, tonight, let's look at the Babylonian captivity. Still looking at the Eastern Diaspora. This took place in 586, the third of 3 captivity dates, but the final one, the climax of them, BC, 586 BC. And the account is found over in 2 Kings chapter 25. Again, we have enough time to read a little bit of this as well. 2 Kings chapter 25. The 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the 2 walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated, and so forth. Verse 13, the Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars, the movable stands, the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and carried away the bronze to Babylon. Into verse 21 kind of sums it up. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. And then if you look in the last chapter of 2 Chronicles, chapter 36 parallels this. 2 Chronicles 36. Beginning with verse 15. The Lord, the God of your fathers, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or aged. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, the treasures of the Lord's temple, the treasures of the king and his officials. And they set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. And then what do we see? In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may the Lord his God be with him, let him go up. Who? Anyone. That would include the remnant of the northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes of Israel that were still there in the same realm of Babylonia. for them also to go up. And according to 1 Chronicles 9 and verse 3 and the 2 verses I gave you in Ezra, representatives from all 12 tribes are found in Mesopotamian captivity, in Judean restoration as well. Now, as far as the southern kingdom is concerned, though, we have a rather detailed account, a threefold detailed account of the return. Now, I call it the return of the southern kingdom just because that is more specified. The preponderance of the returnees were probably from the southern kingdom. The returns: A, under Zerubbabel; B, Ezra; C, Nehemiah. The first group under Zerubbabel numbered about 50,000 men. From the computation of Ezra, about 50,000. The other two returns under Ezra and Nehemiah, do you remember? Did they number more or less? Much less. Just a handful of people in comparison. Now, surely more people were taken from Israel or Judah and or birthed in Assyria and Babylonia than this small figure. Surely more people were taken and or birthed in those lands of captivity than what we find returning here. So what happens to those people then? Well, they stay. This would have to lead us to the conclusion that many more remained behind. Let's just call it Babylonia now, since she took over Assyria. Many more people remained behind in Babylonia than dared to return. Josephus said in Antiquities 11:5-2, there were innumerable myriads, is a direct quote. Antiquities 11:5-2. Josephus said there remained behind innumerable myriads. That means thousands of thousands remained behind. Now there's proof from a Jewish historian himself. And we would need that proof. Just our own deductions and guesses and surmisings would lead us to that conclusion that surely more people were taken in captivity than the 50,000 that returned. And regardless of how many were taken, you've got 70 years for birth and the repopulation of the nation while they're in captivity. Why only 50,000 in the first return under Zerubbabel? And then why even fewer under Ezra and Nehemiah, when we know so many of them still are existing in Babylonia? According to Josephus, Antiquities 11:5-2, innumerable myriads. Well, let me give you two suggestions why so few do return and so many do stay in Babylonia. First of all, they may have misinterpreted some of the teachings of the prophets as to what God's plan was. Now, his plan was clear, but it was a twofold plan. Don't we have through Jeremiah's writings the encouragement that whenever you go into captivity, then settle down, build homes, plant your vineyards, raise your livestock, have children, get married? What could happen with a reference like that? It could be easily misinterpreted as to say you're going to be in Babylon forever. You're not coming back, and so just stay there. This is over in Jeremiah chapter 29, if you'll turn with me there. This is a good suggestion, and this probably happened with some of the people, the spiritually dull, who don't listen to everything, who pick and choose what they want to hear and receive and believe. They heard part of what Jeremiah said. They receive a portion of what the Lord spoke through his prophet Jeremiah, but not all of it. Jeremiah 29:1, this is the text of the letter that Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles. Jeremiah is still in Jerusalem. He's writing a letter to the exiles over in Babylon. And what are some of his recommendations? Well, beginning in verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. What's his recommendation? Settle down. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, Give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. You see how that could easily be misinterpreted if you don't take it in the context into consideration and take it in light of everything else that God has to say through Jeremiah, as well as some of the other prophets who God has on the scene at this time. But if you just go right on in the same chapter here, well, probably the next verse, verse 8, yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says, do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Verse 10, this is what the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. All you have to do is read in the same account here, and God predicts the restoration of the people, the northern and the southern kingdoms which have gone into captivity. So that is one possible suggestion, one feasible solution as to why so many Jews remain behind, that they misinterpret. But then we would ask the question, which would then give us a second reason, why would they misinterpret when it's very obvious here? If you just read the whole account, it's almost as though you want to only hear and believe this part, and you only read the first 7 verses, and you don't even get into verse 8 and go down through verse 10, verses 8, 9, and 10. Well, I think the other alternative is probably the most basic one and the most obvious one. They were comfortable. Who wants to pack all of your belongings up in a moving van and take off back to Palestine? What do you have to look forward to but a destroyed temple, a ruined city? And when they're in Babylon, what do they have here? Homes. They're producing children. They have their own fields, gardens, livestock, their own businesses. Who would want to return but the remnant? Who would want to return but the zealous of heart? It's going to be a lot of difficulty. It's a lot easier to stay right there in Babylon. So I would give 2 reasons. One, they may have misinterpreted the prophecies, but then more basic than that, 2, they may have intentionally misinterpreted the prophecy by reading only what they wanted to read from Jeremiah's letter that he sent to them. This was a specific letter he sent to them. In chapter 29, settle down, build your houses. I mean, after you've got your house built and you're settled down, you think of yourself and your own life. You don't want to go anywhere then. Your fields are producing, your livestock are producing. You don't want to go anywhere then. And so when Jeremiah says, now the 70 years are up, it's time to go back to Jerusalem, you say, well, I read in my Bible where he said to settle down here. And so you're only taking part of what Jeremiah's letter said, the first few verses here. So I think human nature would help us interpret that scenario and that problem. Why do the people, so many of them, most of them, thousands, innumerable myriads of them, stay back in Babylon? It's the easy life. They're comfortable there. Now tonight, in summary and conclusion, let me just give you 5 points about the Jews in the East. The Jews in Assyrian, Babylonian captivity. A summation of this study by 5 points. Number 1, Hellenism. This world philosophy, worldview of the Greeks. Hellenism did not touch this area nearly as greatly as the Roman Empire. Therefore, the Jewish makeup, the Jewish philosophical and theological makeup was quite distinct from the Western diaspora. A point not taken into consideration often enough, I feel. We have a clear-fold division here between the Eastern and the Western diaspora, determined by the influence of the philosophical spirit of Hellenism. Hellenism did not extend itself to this part outside of the Roman Empire. And so the Jewish people here were of an entirely different philosophical and theological makeup and were quite distinct from their Western diaspora Jewish brethren. Secondly, this territory was part of the Parthian Empire in the 1st century A.D., and that's really when we're discussing now. Is not the latter half of the 8th century B.C. or the beginning of the 6th century B.C. for the northern and southern periods of captivity respectively, but the 1st century A.D. and the Jewish situation in the world of Christ and the apostles. This territory was known as the Parthian Empire, not the Roman Empire. Rome has skirmishes with the Parthian Empire, but never overcomes it. Number 3, the Jews here were treated very well by their Gentile rulers, which I think again then helps to explain why so many of them remain behind. They are not slaves. They are treated very well. They are given high privileges. Look at Daniel in government. Look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Look at Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king. You want proof of it? There's proof of it. They were treated very well. They were not slaves at all. They were exalted to high religious, high political, high economic positions within these countries. And therefore, once you not only have your family and your home established, but your career established, then you don't want to leave. So that's a point to remember. We have proof for that in the Old Testament. Look at the people like Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah. They're treated so favorably by Cyrus and by all of these other kings. And look at Esther, the little Jewish girl, ends up married to the king of the whole realm, Xerxes. The 4th place, these Jews were considered of purer stock than even the Palestinian Jews. And I believe it's true also. That as far as descent, bloodlines, genealogies are concerned. They were considered of purer stock than even the Palestinian Jews. That was because once they were over there, the only way to keep their identity remain a separate ethnic group. Although they mixed with society as far as politics and everything else is concerned, they had to keep their ethnic identity, so they stayed together. So there was not intermarriage. In Palestine, remember, the Assyrians and the Babylonians not only took Jews out of Palestine, but imported many Gentiles there to remarry with these people and repopulate Palestine. And therefore their bloodlines were not as pure in Palestine as they are over here in Babylon. So you might not have known that. You would think just the reverse is true, but not if you think twice. And fifthly and finally, the greatest of the post-biblical works of Jewish literature were actually done here. The chief among those was the Babylonian Talmud in AD 500. That has been the guiding religious force behind the Jewish people for 1,500 years now. Not your Old Testament. Don't believe that for a moment. The Jews don't even know their Old Testament. The Jews were guided by the decisions of their rabbinical leaders.